Good day and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. We are now on to Genesis chapter 40. And in the previous presentation, I ended by saying that this presentation would be entitled Joseph's Rise to Power. But I got ahead of myself. This presentation is entitled Joseph, the Interpreter of Dreams, and will focus entirely on Genesis chapter 40. So without further ado, let's get right into it by looking at Joseph, the Interpreter of Dreams. So Genesis 39 ended with Joseph still incarcerated, but he was given great responsibility by the warden of the prison to oversee the operations therein. And Genesis 40 verse 1 tells us this. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And in the previous presentation, I made a point that Joseph was placed in Potiphar's house because Potiphar was the captain of the guard, and the prison was located in his house. So Joseph, even though he was incarcerated, was still in Potiphar's house. So these two royal officers, the butler and the baker, were placed in prison because they were evidently the suspects accused of trying to poison the king of Egypt. So it is my speculation that these two officers of Pharaoh were suspects in an assassination plot against the Pharaoh. And as a result, they were placed in ward so that an investigation could be done to see if they were guilty or innocent. So the butler was Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, and he had sole responsibility for the king's wine, while the baker had charge over everything pertaining to the provision and preparation of Pharaoh's food. So that is why it is plausible, it is my sanctified imagination that I'm using to suggest that these two officers of Pharaoh were accused of trying to poison the king. The Hebrew word translated as butler or cupbearer is the Hebrew word mashke. It occurs 19 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 4945. It has been translated as butler 9 times and cupbearer 3 times. Mashke, properly causing to drink, that is a butler, by implication, the drink itself. And the Hebrew word translated as baker is the Hebrew word afar. It occurs 25 times in the scriptures, and it is Strong's H 644. It has been translated as bake 13 times, baker 11 times, and bake meats once. So the butler was in charge of the bakery. He was in charge of the preparation of the sweet treats as well as the meats that Pharaoh ate. So these officials had great importance and therefore were committed to the care of the captain of the guard until their case could be investigated, as we will find out a little later in the presentation. Genesis 40 verse 4 to 7 tells us this. And the captain of the guard, who is Potiphar, charged Joseph with them. So even though Joseph was imprisoned by Potiphar, this is another reason why it is safe to say that Potiphar did not believe his wife concerning Joseph, because he still gave Joseph an important job to do on his behalf in the prison. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. So they were only in prison for a short while. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, the baker and the butler, each man his dream in one night. Each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sad today? So Joseph was concerned about their appearance. So the important point to notice is this. For Joseph to note that the butler and the baker looked sad that day meant that he took a keen interest in their countenance on a daily basis. which was an indication that Joseph was very meticulous. And notice their response to him. And they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. So Joseph's concern for the well-being of these men gives us another glimpse into his caring character, because he offered to help ease their troubled mind. And Joseph made it absolutely clear that all interpretations belonged to God. So Joseph gave God credit. Viewers, as we can remember, Joseph was mocked by his brothers and called a dreamer himself. And since he had first-hand experience of receiving dreams, he was also confident that God who gave dreams could also interpret them. So prior to Genesis 40, God only communicated to 3 persons by way of a dream. And these 3 persons are Abimelech, Jacob, and Laban. And we can see these 3 instances where God communicated to individuals via a dream. Genesis 20 verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night. And this was when he took Sarah for himself, not knowing that she was Abraham's wife, because Abraham told him that she was his sister. And God said this to Abimelech in the dream, behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. So this was the first instance in scripture that God appeared to a person in a dream. The second instance is with Jacob. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And he said, here am I. And we can also remember in Genesis 28, God appeared to Jacob in a dream where he saw a ladder pitched on the earth, reaching all the way up to heaven, where he saw God standing above. He saw angels ascending and descending upon that ladder. And the third time before the butler and the baker had their dream was in Genesis 31 verse 24, when God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Viewers, let's get back to Genesis 40 verse 9 to 11 as we break down the dream that the butler had in the first instance. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. This was the butler's dream, and it was clearly prophetic and symbolic. And as he told the dream, the official saw himself doing the work of a butler again, when he pressed grapes into Pharaoh's cup and gave it to the king. And Joseph then interpreted the dream and said unto him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand, after the former manner when thou was his butler. And then Joseph made a request of the butler, because Joseph was so confident in the interpretation of the dream. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. So viewers, based on Joseph's interpretation of the dream, the butler will, not may, will be restored to his former position. And Joseph was so confident of the interpretation coming to pass in 3 days that he made a request of the butler to mention him to Pharaoh when his dream came true, so that he could be released from prison. So having heard Joseph's interpretation of the butler's dream, the baker would now tell Joseph about his dream. Genesis 40 verse 16 to 19 tells us this. When the chief baker saw, notice, when he realized that Joseph interpreted favorably the butler's dream, when he saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there was of all manner of baked meats, for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. Viewers, unlike the butler, the baker did not see himself restored to his former position, but he would be decapitated in 3 days' time and hanged on a tree to be food for the ravenous birds of prey, the vultures. Viewers, the baker had hoped for a good interpretation of his own dream, similar to that of the butler, but it wasn't to be, and Joseph delivered God's message of judgment without fear or favor, because Joseph understood that the fate of both men were shown to them based on their innocence or guilt in the matter under investigation. The butler was innocent and the baker was guilty. And notice what we are then told in Genesis 40 verse 20. And it came to pass the 3rd day, just as Joseph had interpreted. It came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants, meaning they were also invited to Pharaoh's birthday party. So they were released from prison. And notice what then transpired. Genesis 40 verse 21 to 23. And he, Pharaoh, restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, just as Joseph had said. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. And notice what we are then told. After his dream came true, that is the dream of the chief butler, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. So viewers, 3 days later, after Joseph interpreted their dream in the morning, on Pharaoh's birthday, Joseph was proved to be correct in his interpretation of both dreams, because the God who gave the dreams told Joseph what the dream meant, and he relayed the message to both the butler and the baker. However, viewers, Joseph was forgotten by the butler, but Jehovah was with Joseph, because remember, that was the theme of Genesis chapter 39. Jehovah was with Joseph, Jehovah was with him. And he would later jog the memory of the butler and secure Joseph's release from prison. Viewers, that brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 40, where we looked at Joseph interpreting the dreams of both the butler and the baker. In the next presentation, which will be entitled Joseph Interprets Pharaoh's Dream, we will look at how God orchestrated that Pharaoh himself will have a dream, and there will be no one to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And it would be down to the butler who forgot Joseph. God would then jog his memory, and he would then make mention of Joseph to Pharaoh, and Joseph would be released from prison and brought before Pharaoh, where he would now be put in a position by God to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And as a result of his interpretation, Pharaoh would make Joseph the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. So stay tuned to the next presentation. We will look at Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And may God continue to bless us as we continue to delve into his word to prove all things. Have yourselves a great day.